Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Goldthorp, President and Chief Development Officer at SickKids Foundation, and welcome this afternoon to our SickKids Ask Our Experts webinar series. It's my pleasure to welcome you, our supporters and friends of the Hospital for Sick Children, to our January edition of Ask Our Experts. I'm going to take our guest panel through a series of questions we developed, incorporating questions from you received in advance. But please use our question pane to submit new or additional questions, and our host moderator will work with me throughout the broadcast to do our best to weave them into our discussion. Now, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our four panelists. First of all, Dr. Ronald Cohn is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Hospital for Sick Children. Dr. Cohn joined SickKids in September of 2012 as a Chief of the Division of Clinical and Metabolic Genetics, Co-Director of the Center for Genetic Medicine, Senior Scientist at SickKids Research Institute, and inaugural Women's Auxiliary Chair in Clinical and Metabolic Genetics. In 2016, Dr. Cohn became Chief of Pediatrics. In 2019, Chief Executive Officer. Dr. Cohn leads SickKids' focus in precision child health, and in his own research focuses on implementing genome editing technologies for the treatment of neurogenetic disorders. Dr. Jean-Philippe Julien from Baie-Comeau, Quebec. Jean-Philippe, or JP, was educated at McGill and the University of Toronto and did postdoctoral work at the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego, California. Jean-Philippe is a senior scientist at the SickKids Research Institute, is a Canada Research Chair in Structural Immunology, and was appointed in 2019 as a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. His research focuses on antibodies and vaccine discovery and therapeutic development. Next, Dr. Isaac Odame. Dr. Odame is a hematology section head in the Division of Hematology Oncology and the medical director of the Global Sickle Cell Disease Network at the Center for Global Child Health at SickKids. He's a professor and director of the Division of Adult and Pediatric Hematology in the Departments of Medicine and Pediatrics at the University of Toronto, where he holds the Alexander Yeo Chair in Hematology. In connection with the pandemic, Dr. Odame's work focuses on vaccine hesitancy and working across ethnic communities to ensure vaccine adoption. Next, Dr. Michelle Science. Dr. Science is a medical school graduate from McMaster University, completed her residency and postdoctoral work at the University of Toronto. She's an infectious diseases consultant within the Division of Infectious Diseases at SickKids, where she's been since 2012, has been the medical advisor for infection prevention and control, and the co-lead of our antimicrobial stewardship program. Dr. Science has been involved in the response to COVID-19 pandemic, both locally and provincially, and is currently leading a multi-center study testing healthcare workers for antibodies to COVID-19. Michelle was also one of the lead authors of the Back to School guidance from SickKids and co-principal investigator of the SickKids Back to School simulation study. So I am now going to take our panelists through a series of questions and turn to them in turn to answer, and certainly again to all four of you, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Ronnie, if I can start with you. Could you summarize where Ontario and Toronto are today in terms of approved vaccines and the vaccination plans?
So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The answer to this question has been quite a bit of a moving target, but let's start with the easy things. So we currently have 2 Health Canada approved vaccines from Pfizer-BioNTech as well as from Moderna, and we will talk later a little bit about the mechanism of how these new vaccines are working. And we knew early on that our supply would be somewhat limited to each of the provinces in Canada, and therefore on the federal and then also on the provincial level, we worked through a priority list of trying to make sure that the individuals who are really at highest risk are being vaccinated first. And first and foremost, these are obviously residents of long-term care facilities, as well as the staff members who work at these congregate settings, who have by and large been vaccinated, at least in the hot zone areas, with their first vaccine dose. And then part of the priority list, at least until the end of March, are frontline healthcare workers. And The plan as of now is to try to complete these priority populations as soon as we can. And many of you have heard that the supply from Pfizer has been reduced for the next few weeks due to changes in their planned restructuring in Belgium. But we hope that we will get, in the end, the expected number of vaccine doses so that we can really address these priority groups first. And then between April and July, we will then really go down and try to immunize other people who are at high risk. For example, the elderly population who doesn't live in a long-term care facility. Teachers are going to be part of this. Other healthcare workers who will not be able to get vaccinated during the first period will get vaccinated. And really the overall goal and guiding principles for these priorities have been set by trying to identify who are the individuals who are at highest risk from either getting very sick from COVID-19 and or being exposed a lot to situations where there's a high risk of getting infected from COVID-19.
Sorry, novice mistake. Thanks, Ronnie. Could I turn back to Michelle just to elaborate for a second on this? You've set a beautiful context, and just to be one of the key questions every single person remotely connected with healthcare gets is, okay, I understand the priorities and it's completely logical and completely understandable. Absolutely, we must make sure our frontline healthcare workers immunize first, long-term care. It's how we understanding or bring some clarity to how then it affects me and my family is a question we get. And in asking you this, Michelle, I want to be clear, SickKids is not a vaccination site, is not engaged in leading rollout. But can you help us just elaborate how and when does someone watching today, or watching a recording of this, learn when they can access a vaccine? When does that person, when does average citizen learn when they get the vaccine, how they access the vaccine, especially if you're not someone who's in long-term care or who is not a frontline caregiver?
Sure, I can try to tackle that question. So as Ronnie mentioned, the vaccine is currently available to long-term care home and retirement home residents, healthcare workers, essential caregivers, and adults in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations. And this phase 1 rollout started December 2020. Phase 2, some of you may fall into that group, is planned to start, again, as Ronnie mentioned, March, April of 2021 and run into July, depending on availability. And that plan will vaccinate about 8.5 million people. And the groups prioritized there will be older adults. So starting with those 80 and older and then decreasing in 5-year increments over the course of the vaccine rollout. People who live and work in high-risk congregate settings, frontline essential workers, including the teachers and food processing industry, individuals with high-risk conditions and their caregivers, and then other populations and communities facing barriers to the determinants of health across Ontario who are at greatest risk of COVID-19. So the phase 3 is estimated to start around August 2020, again, depending on availability, and this will involve the remaining Ontario general populations. And in terms of operationalizing the vaccine rollout, unfortunately, there's limited details available so far, aside from the plan to have more community-focused resources to deliver the immunizations. So moving away from having only the current hospital-based vaccination clinics to having an increased number of vaccination sites, including mobile vaccination sites, pharmacies, clinics, and primary care settings. Details on how to sign up for the vaccine, I'm sure will come as time moves on and as we move through these phases. So I would keep an eye on the Ministry of Health website, as well as the news for an indication of when that information will be available. But as you may know, we've started to see the city getting ready for larger scale vaccination clinics. So that's an exciting next step.
Great, thank you. Between combination of you, Ronnie and Michelle, thank you. I think it leaves us with a good understanding of, given that there's very little information, a good understanding of what to expect and when to expect it. Dr. Odame, Isaac, could I turn to you now? You're a member of a number of task forces on vaccine adoption, including the Black North Vaccine Task Force. We have also followed work by you and others over higher infection rates around marginalized non-white workforces working in frontline service industries that have allowed the economy to keep functioning. What issues related to these communities are you considering as plans are being developed for mass immunization?
Thank you for that question. So we've been looking to tackle this problem because these racialized communities that are at risk of COVID are the very communities that have high vaccine hesitancy rates. So the combination of that two is worrying, that if the at-risk group like Black population and other racialized populations are not going to take the vaccine, then it jeopardizes the goal of trying to achieve herd immunity by vaccinating a large proportion of the population. Now, we're trying to understand the basis of this hesitancy. One of the factors is long-standing mistrust of the health system. This has some historical undertones. It has some issues to relate to other social determinants of low income, low housing, more prevalent underlying conditions like diabetes, obesity, food insecurity. All these factors are culminating in producing high rates of COVID among the racialized populations. And in Toronto, we do have some evidence that while the Black population accounts for 9% of the Toronto population, they account for 21% of COVID cases. So this really has to be addressed. And the way we are trying to address it is using evidence that suggests that people of African descent, when they receive health information from experts who are from the same community, they are twice more likely to trust it. And so in doing so, we are trying to raise a number of Black clinicians and scientists, people with expertise, to be the messengers to these communities, using their community leaders as a channel to reach their community. In other words, trying to overcome the mistrust. So by actually taking away the level of mistrust, we hope that these communities will receive more appropriate, well-informed sort of facts about COVID vaccine in the hope that vaccine hesitancy will be reduced. We just are aiming that every person of racialized community has the opportunity to get information that is accurate, that is well presented, to counteract all the misinformation and the misconceptions that pervade in the community.
Thank you. Well, important job for everyone in our various roles to model leadership, be open to learning the facts, and then demonstrating leadership by getting the vaccine and being clear they're getting the vaccine. Thank you, Isaac, for this work. JP, Isaac mentioned herd immunity. Our media have made us aware of this concept. If you weren't an expert in some terms a year ago, you certainly hear and use these terms now. Can you, as a vaccine researcher, can you speak to the concept of herd immunity and what the strategy should or could be through vaccinating the public to move toward our achieving herd immunity?
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. This is a very important concept. It's the concept where you realize that vaccines are not just biomedical interventions that are for self. They're biomedical interventions that are very much in a community setting, and that there is the concept of preventing transmission. So herd immunity is very much related to the concept of transmission and created dead ends for the virus to not be able to transmit onwards or to lead to new infections. And so, of course, if a virus has high transmissibility rates, very easy to infect onwards and onwards, then you need a level of herd immunity that's very high. And so the concept of immunity is basically to have your immune system create a barrier to either new infections or to disease or to onward transmission if you do become infected. And so depending on all of these parameters, the concept of herd immunity is defined at a threshold above which a virus no longer expands in its propagation, but instead shrinks because it has nowhere to really go. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you. No surprise, best explanation I've heard in quite some time of that, so that helps us. And we'll come back to some of those concepts a bit later on, JP. Now, Michelle, the number gets thrown around, sort of 70% being a number we talked about in this context for this virus. Now, can you comment on this application of the 70% to children? When we're understanding 70% of the population being vaccinated, are we including children? And can you perhaps give us an update on what our current understanding of COVID-19 and is for children, and whether children need to be part of that 70% vaccination?
So great questions. And I think when you're talking about vaccinating children, there are really two considerations. There's protection for the child, and then there's protection for the community and the herd immunity, which JP spoke of. So for children, what we continue to see is that for the vast majority of them, COVID-19 is a mild disease with few complications. And so from an individual protection point of view, there seems to be less of a need for a vaccine for children, although complications can occur and there may be higher risk populations where vaccination would be indicated for individual protection. However, from an overall community transmission perspective, we know that children can get infected and they can transmit the virus. And so for overall pandemic control, it will likely be important to vaccinate children moving forward, especially if we want to meet the 70% target, which is an estimate and may change, especially with the new variants that we're hearing more about. So the other important thing is this assumes that the vaccine is effective at preventing asymptomatic infection and transmission. And while we're still gathering data about this, it seems likely that it will be the case. And this data should be available by the time vaccines are approved for children, and we'll be able to put the whole picture together to make a clearer recommendation for children.
Thank you, helpful. Then supplementary to Ronnie and potentially back to Michelle on this one. My understanding is that neither the Moderna nor the Pfizer vaccines were trialed on children under 18 and under 16, the two different vaccines. Can you comment on, do you guys confirm that my understanding is correct, and then confirm why vaccines aren't typically trialed on children and youth, and then how long it might take to get trials underway and get approvals in place for children and youth?
Yeah, so your numbers are correct. So the Moderna vaccine has been tested in individuals 18 and up, and the Pfizer vaccine has been tested in individuals 16 and up. So there's now a trial that has started before the end of last year with the Moderna vaccine that is looking at children between 12 and 16. And Pfizer has just announced that they're also planning to do a trial in children between 12 and 16. I will say the plan was that these trials of 3,000 children, at least by Moderna, would be completed early in the spring so that we would have data and potentially approve this for children by the summer or fall. What is interesting, and that addresses to some degree your question, the company is currently struggling with enrollment to find participants who are willing to participate in the study. So it may take a little bit longer until we have results in this population. AstraZeneca is also planning a trial for the spring in children. They haven't announced the age range yet. Initially, they were considering going down to 10 years of age, but that hasn't been confirmed yet.
Thanks, Ronnie. Now, to both of you, introduce Michelle in your introduction. Ronnie, you've been very, very public. We talked here in August about this, SickKids recommendations about return to school. And are there, of course, it's always based on the most recent, best available facts. Given vaccination knowledge to date, and this looking to even the next school year to have a vaccine potentially, if trialed and approved for children and teens, given we know about COVID-19 right now in children and youth, what implications do you think this has for, in Toronto, the GTA, returning to in-class education?
Michelle, you want to go first?
I put a hot question, not to you, both of you.
I mean, I do obviously hope that children will be able to return to in-class learning. I think, I was happy to see that some of the essential caregivers like teachers and educational assistants are in line for the phase 2 rollout of vaccine, which I think will help support that. But I don't think, there's a lot to learn with the new variants and otherwise. So I think, we're going to have to monitor the situation closely as we move forward. I think that the health and safety measures that are currently in place will need to continue to be in place for some time as we move forward. But I do hope that our strategies around enhanced infection and prevention and control and enhanced testings in school will be able to support children returning to in-class learning, regardless of whether they have a vaccine. I don't know, Ronnie, if you have anything to add.
Ronnie.
I really have nothing to add to this. That just sums it up. I think what might be important to just emphasize again that I think it is likely that the bundled measures Michelle talked about regarding health and safety for children will still be in place for the beginning of the new school year starting September, because it's unlikely that we will have the majority of children vaccinated at that point.
Thank you both. Not an unfair question, but a really important question, one where we've got lots of pre-questions on. Isaac, if I can turn to you first, and then Michelle, I think, or Ronnie or JP, we received a number of questions in advance about specific child health situations and conditions, and we can't address personal health questions. And you've already heard that we have no vaccine yet studied or approved for use in children and youth. Can we say, let's go forward some months from now, and suppose we do have a vaccine approved for use in children? This is very dangerous ground I'm going here. How will you and colleagues be counseling families and patients when you're seeing them in clinics where there might be concerns, say around a child with a transplant patient, a heart patient, or one with severe food allergies or Crohn's disease? Can you take us through, of course, you're not prescribing here, but take us through some of your thinking consideration in general, and of course I'll emphasize, and we'll have to consult with your physician.
Yes, I think generally this is the current situation we have in regards to flu vaccine, for example, and other vaccines that children take. I mean, in child health is a period when a lot of vaccines are administered to children. And in SickKids, where we have children with various conditions, some that are immunocompromised and some that are at risk of severe infections, these are decisions we take all the time. And in my view, it's not going to be very different with the COVID vaccine in terms of how we decide who needs to take it. I think generally, those who are vulnerable, so long as they can tolerate the vaccine and at risk of dying from COVID, are more likely to be encouraged to receive it. I think the only contraindication would be if there is a severe allergic reaction of something that could be life-threatening. But I would like my colleagues weigh in. I think in pediatrics, these are issues that we consider all the time. Somebody has a bone marrow transplant, you wait for their immune system to recover before they take live vaccines, for example. And there are decisions that come into play in everyday practice. And I don't think those considerations will be any different for COVID vaccine.
Thank you, Isaac. Michelle, anything you want to add?
No, I would agree and just echo what's already been said. I mean, with any medication or vaccine, we're always reviewing the risks and benefits of the vaccine using the information gathered from trials as well as from NACI, which is the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, and we would provide recommendations to patients and families. And in infectious diseases, we're always working very closely with the subspecialties and specialties like the transplant team and the oncology groups to develop recommendations specific to the patient populations. And I would anticipate similar collaboration moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Again, it was important. I know I was asking you to speculate, which is never good. It should never happen. But we had so many questions about this that I want to reflect and allow you to reemphasize a point. Like any other vaccine, let's wait for the facts, and then we'll counsel based upon the facts. Thank you very much. JP, can I take us in a slightly more technical direction? I'm going to answer some general questions first about sort of vaccine strategies. Certainly another angle at this now is the technical understanding of vaccine development. I wonder if you could help us understand the two currently approved vaccines in Canada, the Pfizer BioNTech and the one from Moderna. And we know there's one being used in the UK, developed by Oxford and AstraZeneca. Could you take a moment and give us some insight explaining the underlying technologies of the mRNA-based approach used by Pfizer and Moderna versus a vector approach used by AstraZeneca?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, from a vaccine development perspective, there's a lot of tools and technologies that exist that are in the toolbox, and some of them consist of whole viruses that are then attenuated. Some of them consist of only subunits, only some parts of the viruses that are then taken out of the viral context and then delivered as subunits that are called. And it's important to understand that there are over 150 different technologies that are being explored in different preclinical and clinical settings. And the front runners that are emerging are technologies that don't have to do with whole viruses that have been attenuated. They're technologies that are only focusing on certain small subunit aspects. And so the question is, in the vial, how do you deliver these subunits? And so you can deliver it after manufacturing of the actual type of viral components, or you can deliver it in a way that is encoding that component such that your own cells can make it. And so these are related to genetic type subunit vaccines, whether they're mRNA encoded or DNA encoded. And so those are the ones that we're seeing at the forefront of the vaccine race, because making these type of genetic technologies is more rapid than making protein subunits coupled with adjuvants or whole viruses that have been attenuated. And so those are the ones that we have at our approval. And of course, they've been vetted incredibly thoroughly through all the processes, whether they were in clinical trials, whether they were by our regulatory bodies, to make sure that their safety and efficacy were met and of desirable outcome.
And I get you just to take one step back, because you're I think don't want to assume that everyone's actually understood well what they've seen on newscasts or in print online about mRNA technology. Can you just explain the mRNA technology? Then I'm going to ask Ronnie a follow-up question about safety of mRNA technology. So can you just could you take us through this technique, since it's comparatively new?
Yeah, so the mRNA is kind of an intermediate message from the hard coding genetic material that is in DNA and on its way to making a protein subunit. And so it's kind of this intermediate that is also short-lived. And so when you make an mRNA type vaccine, you're delivering kind of this intermediate message that will then tell the cells how to make just that small protein subunit that you want the immune system to react with. And so one of the aspects that's very interesting in mRNA technology is its transient nature. And so that's something that is very well documented. And it's a technology that's been explored over the last decades, but has really emerged over, I'd say, the last decade with its ability to be very rapid in delivery, in manufacturing, and has also kind of picked up many clinical trials in other infectious disease over the last few years.
Okay, thank you, JP. So I'll turn it to you, Ronnie. You're a geneticist, genetic surgeon. You work with DNA, RNA as its consequence. Can you give us some sense about your perception on the efficacy and the safety of this new mRNA technology?
Yeah, so this is a question I get asked a lot in terms of how safe is this technology, because it's new, right? We haven't had an mRNA vaccine. And let me just go back to a little bit of what JP really said. So what this vaccine does, it's first of all, it's encoded in what we call a nanoparticle. And what this does is that once you get your shot into your arm, into your muscle, it travels to specific cells within your lymph node. So the first question I'm getting asked a lot is, does it go all over your body? No, it actually just goes into the lymph node and then into the specific cells that are important for our immune response. And what this mRNA does is it's really giving the cell a recipe to create a small piece of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And it's this spike protein that many of you have probably heard about before. And because it's just this small portion, you don't really get sick from the protein that's being made, but it's enough to create the immune response that is so important that we are looking for. Now, what's really important then is that once this protein is made, the cell actually has a mechanism to kind of destroy the mRNA. So it doesn't sit around, and this is what JP said, it's really rapid. So you make the protein, the cell destroys the mRNA, and maybe the most critical point that people are wondering about, this mRNA template, this recipe giver, never enters into the nucleus of the cell where it could potentially affect the genetic material. So it really, from everything we know from the research over the last decade, as well as all these very thoroughly conducted preclinical trial in animals, as well as trials in humans, it's a very safe technology. And maybe just one last point, as JP alluded to, why are we seeing these coming to the forefront first? Because the technology to actually produce this is significantly faster than many of the other technologies. It will also help us to quickly change some of the message that may have to be changed if during the next few months or even years, the virus is going to mutate so much that the vaccine has to be slightly altered, which would be less of an issue with this technology than some of the other technologies.
Very helpful. Ronnie, thank you addressing both the safety issues and it's comforting to know that this, if you will, the cell destroys this on its own volition. So it's great comfort to understand that level of detail. Now, I have a question then for all four of you, and jump in as you wish here. The development of the vaccine seemed very rapid. We're 10 months in. So from a layperson perspective, I think the question definitely comes up is, look, there's still no vaccine for SARS-CoV-1. There's no vaccine for MERS, for HIV. Why has the world achieved such rapid success in developing vaccines against COVID-19, but not these other viruses?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one. It's an excellent question, and I think it's important to realize that every infectious disease has its own challenges. And of course, SARS-CoV-2, has a lot of problems associated with it, but it doesn't have all the ones, for example, from HIV or influenza, which are viruses that really mutate rapidly. They have the ability to have so much genetic diversity, so many variants. Some of them are circulating at the same time worldwide. And so when you're trying to vaccinate against all those variants, that becomes very challenging. And so that's why, for example, a vaccine against HIV has been elusive for decades. And also why there is the concept of seasonal influenza vaccination because of that genetic diversity. So when we see that talk about variants of SARS-CoV-2 that are emerging, as Michelle was saying, we're paying very close attention to what that diversity looks like, because we're hoping that we're not in a situation where we have to have many different types of vaccines that need to be updated all the time. But that might be something that emerges as a consideration. And at the moment, I think we know that the SARS-CoV-2 is not mutating as rapidly as HIV or influenza. So that's from the virology perspective, we're encouraged by that.
Maybe I can add a little bit more to this. I think as much as many of us in Canada and in some other countries feel frustration that we are not vaccinating enough and we have not enough vaccine at our hand to really massively go through our population, I do think what we are seeing here is the unbelievable power of science. There have been massive investments made by many, many different countries into scientific discovery of vaccines, and that was a very purposeful decision that was made to invest a lot of money into the development of these different vaccines. And I think it is just something to take maybe a step back and recognize the unbelievable achievement what science has given us with the vaccine to a virus that, at least in North America, we haven't really seen in terms of people being infected. We have heard about this virus for a little bit longer, but in less than 9 months, we were able to produce a vaccine. And that's not because anybody has taken any kind of shortcuts. It's just because of very dedicated, concentrated efforts of scientists literally all around the world who decided to make this their priority.
If I may add one point, I think the fact that the pandemic was raging made it easier to get the reliable data of the vaccine's efficacy much quicker. So if you imagine if the infection was not that rampant, it would take us longer to know whether it works. But testing this vaccine in the midst of a raging pandemic was in a way an opportunity to be able to get the data much quicker. That's also a point to make, that we were fortunate in that respect.
It's finding a silver lining. Very true. Michelle, any points you want to make on this?
No, just I think to reemphasize what Ronnie had mentioned, that one of the frequent concerns I hear is just with the timelines and that there may have been shortcuts, but just to reassure that, all of the appropriate clinical trial phases have gone through, the safety and efficacy data have been gathered, and it's really sort of the shortened preclinical and scientific work at the beginning, and then the fact that companies started manufacturing before they had proof that the vaccine was going to have effective clinical trial really allowed us to get it so quickly.
Now we've turned this incredible science, because of the impact of the pandemic, into sort of a reporting score now, and so we hear things. We consumers hear words like Pfizer, Moderna have a 95% efficacy, and the AstraZeneca vaccine has only a 70% efficacy. JP, can you comment whether what that means scientifically, and then perhaps you or other panel members commenting on what does it mean for the end consumer? Do I have to worry about this? Do I have to worry about the 70 versus 95, or is this a scientific interest, not really of consumer interest?
So I would say that those numbers, 70%, 90%, 95%, it means that this is, exceptional. When you listen to where the bar was before, what would we roll out? People were saying 50% efficacy, 40%, there would be rationale for trying to move that forward but this is just spectacular. And the reason why, people had doubts early on is because we're not immunized, or those vaccines don't contain all components of the virus, right? They only contain a very small subunit. And so how were we to know that this was going to be the subunit to put in that would lead to so much good immune responses that would be protective? And that is where I guess I want to link back to what Ronnie was saying about the investment in science. The technology that we're using today that is leading to those numbers of efficacy, whether it's 70 or 95%, which is spectacular, those are discoveries that were made 5 to 10 years ago. And so the investments we've made before are the ones that are being beneficial today. If we had to start from scratch to identify which component do we want to put in, how do we stabilize it in a conformation that makes the virus vulnerable? How are we able to then boost that immune signal that will now be very durable? If we had to ask those questions starting today for vaccine development, then that's when you enter some of those 8 to 10 years of timelines that we're now able to beat. And that is why the investment in science is so critical.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. I'm going to come back to you again for the next follow-up question. Preparing and in broad media, we hear terms about durability, efficacy, breadth. Without giving us an entire vaccine class, can you sort of describe why we care about durability, efficacy, and breadth? Are sort of three of the key metrics I'll say vaccine experts and health experts are looking at when they assess vaccines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the 95% values that we see are, astounding, as I was saying, but that measure is taking X number of days after receiving the second dose. And so, of course, you want that to be at the peak, as high as you can be, and 95% is up there. Now the question becomes, what's the efficacy at 3 months? What's the efficacy at 6 months? What's the efficacy at 1 year? Those numbers really matter. And if I'm to give an example, there's one malaria vaccine, a field that we work in, that the efficacy early on is very high. But if you look at 6 months or 9 months, it collapses to about 30%. And so now you have a vaccine that has very high short-term efficacy, but no durability. And so how that affects a pandemic is quite different than if you're able to maintain durability for a long time. For example, the measles vaccine that is good for a very long time. And so that's where these concepts of efficacy and durability link. And of course, you want your vaccines to be protective also against emerging variants, not just only the one that was there at the beginning, but the one that will be there a year from now if there are any mutations. And so these three concepts of efficacy, durability, and breadth are very, very much linked together in evaluating a vaccine.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Michelle, and I think Michelle and Isaac in combination here on the issue of durability, and we've been acknowledging questions coming through our question pane too. So we have a vaccine now. What is first, we have no data. We have no long-term data on durability, how long it lasts for. But let's just say it ends up being no more than a year in terms of a proper level of efficacy. Do we expect that we start preparing to have an annual COVID-19 flu shot or COVID-19 shot along with our flu shot, and that becomes just part of our normal routine? Is that the new normal for us?
Yeah, so I think as was mentioned, it's very possible that we may need future doses of the vaccine. I think that the hope would be that it could become much more routinely available if we do need future doses. So even with the phase 3 rollout that I mentioned, you can see that there's a push for broader availability of the vaccine in a variety of settings, including primary care offices and pharmacies. So ideally, it wouldn't be a completely separate effort moving forward, and this would be an important focus, I think, to promote uptake, make it easy for people to get it if it's needed, and durability is an issue.
Okay. On this point, I not prepped you, so I apologize, but if I want to answer, we're seeing public commentary about dealing with a shortage of vaccine by changing recommended dosage. Can I turn to one of you to help me out and speak to the issue of, I'll say, going off script and not following the dosage recommendations that were studied and approved for use? And is it safe to get only one dose? Is it smart to only get one dose? What do we know about having one dose versus a second dose? Can we wait 6 months versus 3 weeks?
So maybe I can start, and then some infectious disease colleagues can weigh into the specifics. So I think from all the data we know that were published in scientific journals, as well as the comprehensive data set that was submitted to the FDA and Health Canada, it appears that there will be no negative impact by extending the second dose from either 21 or 28 days with the Pfizer vaccine to up to 42 days. That seems to be a scientific consensus at the moment. And I'm going to say now something and need my colleagues to confirm whether this is true, because I've spoken to a few of my friends who are immunologists in the States about this question. And what we actually think we understand from in terms of our immune system is that a boost that is being given as a second dose later, even after 28 days, should in theory be at least as good, if not even potentially better, to create protection from the vaccine against the virus. So here, the main reason why this hasn't been in detail studied, whether it's 1 month, 2 months, 3 months in terms of a boost, is just simply the time. And we need to make sure that we have a clinical trial that tests 2 doses that would give enough of a chance of a boost that would then be protected. But I need others to either confirm, or it's fine if you disagree.
Yeah, no, I agree with with Ronnie, and I think what's important, from the way that I see the situation is that everybody understands that, a prime and a boost is, what we're lining up to achieve. It's not, should you have a boost, right? The question, you should have a boost. That's how you boost your immunity. That's how you encode long-term memory. That's how you have the strongest immunity, so that you can either have sterilizing protection so that the virus doesn't come in, or even if you do get infected, because it's not 100%, then you're able to really suppress the virus to levels that will, one, not allow to have a lot of mutations, potentially, but also that you will have reduced viral load so that you can't transmit it onwards. And so I think there's no question in the community that you do want that boost. And of course, aspirationally, we would want a vaccine that is only one dose. And I think there's a lot of work to try to achieve that. That's ongoing. But I think, how it is deployed in the short term, what's the delays between the doses? That's an important question. But ultimately, everybody should be committed, in my opinion, to going for the prime and the boost.
Thank you both very much. Can I keep us moving? And Isaac asked you a question about sort of Health Canada approval. Can you provide some insights in terms of what we need to understand as a consumer, what kind of process Health Canada goes through to approve? Why does it take so long, for instance, to get the third one or the fourth vaccine approved? So we understand what's happening behind the walls of Health Canada and how then we end up with a vaccine that we can trust.
That question is very interesting because on the one hand, people are worried about the warp speed. And yet on the other hand, people are worried about why approval is taking so long. And I think it's a very interesting concept there. But to walk you through, Health Canada's job is to make sure that independent scientific experts scrutinize the data that has been presented by the developers. And that scrutiny is so intense, you cannot make it any less intense so that you don't miss any information that will impinge on the safety. So before they approve, they consider at least 4 factors. One, is it safe? So I want every hearer to know that safety is #1 concern for Health Canada. Secondly, does it work? Does it work? Is the data they are producing valid? Can it be really confirmed that the data is correct? And then thirdly, they look at the manufacturing processes to see whether they meet all the standards of manufacturing. And overall, what they consider is whether the benefits outweigh the risks. So no drug or vaccine will be approved unless Health Canada is convinced that the benefits outweigh the risks. And that's why the process has to be rigorous, because they don't want to put Canadians at risk.
Thank you, it's very helpful. Kind of combine a couple questions, watching our time here. Michelle, now that we're becoming consumers aware of the brand of vaccine, is there any reason why someone should try to access X vaccine versus Y vaccine, or do you simply take it and say thank you? What's your recommendation from a scientific standpoint?
Good question. I think it's important to get the vaccine available to you when your time comes for vaccination. The vaccines, as Isaac mentioned, will have all gone through the same approval process to make sure that they meet the safety and efficacy standards that are set out by Health Canada. So that's the way it is right now. I think, 2 years from now, the situation could be different. There may be several vaccines approved, and NACI may provide differential guidance or preferential recommendations for certain products in certain populations, but there are no such recommendations right now, and the 2 currently approved vaccines are very similar.
Thank you. So Isaac, and then I'm going to JP, and then a round robin to close. Isaac, I asked you, I talked about your working across ethnic groups in terms of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine adoption. I want to give you a chance to speak to whether the trial data and the research data provide further support to people from all ethnic backgrounds, that enough trial and work has gone into vaccine testing by ethnic group that gives everyone confidence that they have a safe vaccine, an effective vaccine.
Yes, absolutely. I think the developers were careful to make sure that every racial group was represented in the trial of the vaccine safety and efficacy. because they know very well that this issue will arise. So for example, if you take the Black population, in both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, approximately 10% of the participants were of Black origin. So, and if you consider the United States Black population of 13%, I think you will say that that was very well represented. So the assurance we are giving the Black community is that we do know that it's been tested in the Black population. We do know that it is safe in that population. We do know that it works in that population, and all the misinformation they are getting, we can confidently say they should not be swayed by them, and that it works for them and it is safe.
Perfect. Thank you very much. To JP. JP, we've referred to it a few times. I want to ask you before we close. It seems the wild card right now in the fight against COVID-19 could well be the emergence of new strains, variants, mutations. I know you're leading some groundbreaking work in your own right on vaccine development across multiple mutations. Can you speak to the issue of mutations and how vaccine development pardon me, the word double use, is developing or advancing to accommodate multiple mutations of the COVID-19 virus?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that these RNA viruses, which SARS-CoV-2 is, have the propensity to accumulate mutations. And mutations usually are acquired and explored by the virus in a way that could gain higher transmissibility. So it could become more and more infectious. And that's what we're seeing in some of the variants that are emerging. And now whether that leads to more severe disease or higher mortality, that is not what has been seen so far, but just the sheer number. So now, how can we have a vaccine that's as broad as possible? And how can we anticipate the future? And I think we've set the bar at a place where we want to curb SARS-CoV-2, and that's what the vaccine right now is trying to do. And so how broad will it be, right? So the goal here is not to curb all beta coronaviruses that infect humans. It's specifically this one, and then hopefully all the strains. But we need to keep working on technologies that are aspirational, that can cover as an umbrella not only this particular SARS-CoV-2, but broader in beta coronaviruses. That would be an aspirational goal for the future, and there's plenty of groups working on that.
Thank you. Thanks, JP. For a closing question, a round robin to all of you, if I can start with Isaac, and then JP, Michelle, and then Ronnie. And we looking forward, sort of final thoughts, but also whether there's I'll say silver linings, whether there's important advances or insights we've made because of the research, the science has gone on in the last 9 months, 10 months, and then sort of final thoughts you'd want to leave with any listener or viewer today. Isaac, starting with you.
Before COVID-19 came, the fastest vaccine that had been developed was mumps vaccine, and that took 4 years. To be able to develop a vaccine within 10 months is something that we should all celebrate as a triumph of science and the profit you make by investing in science. And this vaccine development has set the bar so high. And let's hope that these technologies will be ready for the next pandemic that comes.
Thanks. Thank you, Isaac. JP.
Yeah, so I think, I'll build off of that. I think, 2 points. So the first one is that, 10 months to development, a few more months to deployment, it's record speed. But lots of suffering have happened over the last year and a half before implementation. And so although we are celebrating science, there's still room to improve. How do we have technologies that can respond to pandemics even faster than what we've achieved here? And I think that's the next frontier of the 10 years of science in infectious diseases. And the second point that I'll say, if I may, is that it's important we celebrate the accessibility of those vaccines that are there today in Canada. But it's important to recognize that these vaccines are not available all around the world. And there is a lot of that we can do as Canadians to try to help regions where, next vaccine technologies are required to meet the costs and broad deployment. And so we should serve or take our role in getting vaccinated ourselves, but also work towards getting some of those next vaccine technologies around the world as well.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. Michelle.
Similar comments. It was pretty much 1 year ago that we identified the first case of SARS-CoV-2 in Ontario, and I really didn't think we would be in a position to have started vaccinating less than a year later. So I feel that we're, very fortunate to have researchers like JP, whose work in vaccines before and during the pandemic have really allowed us to have this happen. So thank you, JP and others. Moving forward, we still have a lot to learn about durability and protection, and it's going to take time to vaccinate enough people. So I guess this is just my plug for all of us to continue to follow the public health guidance. Even though we're all tired, we need to continue to work together. And thank you to all of you out there attending the webinar for all the sacrifices that you've made and the support you've provided our healthcare system.
Thank you, Michelle. Ronnie.
I can't top that ending from Michelle right now, other than saying, I know the beginning of the year has been tough for all of us. We are tired, we are frustrated by the high numbers we are seeing, by some of the glitches in the supply chains of the vaccines, and it is going to get better. It may take a little bit longer, but it is going to get better. And I will go out on a limb and say that I'm convinced that come early summer or maybe even spring, things will look much better and much different.
Thank you, Ronnie. Well, I'll be so bold and impertinent to say that on behalf of everyone listening and all the donors who support SickKids and the general public, we're so grateful for what the four of you and all of your colleagues do for driving forward science, for making sure that the facts are well understood, for caring so deeply about people here in Canada and globally. We're very grateful for what you do each and every day. Yes, looking forward to silver lining in the future. And I'll close by acknowledging one question that came through from our question pane about the mental health implications. We've raised this a few times in the last 10 months, and just note that our next webinar will in fact go back to the issue of mental health. So I'll say thank you very much to our panelists, to our viewers, to our supporters, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks to talk again about mental health in children and adults because of the pandemic. Thank you. Stay safe, stay distant, wear your mask, and stay healthy. Good night, everyone.
Good night.